If you live in Egypt right now, you've probably heard at least one of these numbers. Foreign reserves above $50 billion, economic growth raised from 4.9% to 5.2%, debt service this year around $38 billion. They sound abstract. They sound far away from the price of your electricity bill or the cost of filling your tank. But in the last week, one Egyptian economist summed it up with a single image. Out of every £10 the state collects, £8.5 go straight to the creditors. In this episode, we're going to unpack that sentence. We'll combine what we saw in the previous talks about reserves, gold and inflation with this new conversation about debt service and the budget. And we'll keep asking the same question. After all the charts, all the slides and all the ratings, how much is actually left for the people who live in the country? 1. From recovery headlines to a simple fraction. Last time we looked at three big ideas using Egypt as a case study. Nominal versus real, numbers that grow just because prices grow. Debt service ratio, how much of the budget goes to interest and repayments. Valuation gains versus cash flow, reserves that rise on paper because gold is more expensive. We saw that official foreign reserves climbed above $50 billion, but analysts expect Egypt to need at least $50 billion in external payments in a single year for maturing loans, deposits, interest and essential imports. Now this week, another layer was added. An economist took the government's own budget structure and described it like this. Around 65% of total expenditures, debt service. Around 85% of government revenues, debt service. In everyday language, for every £10 the state collects in revenue, about £8.5 go to past debt, interest plus repayments, and only £1.5 are left for everything else. Owe salaries, owe hospitals, owe schools, owe infrastructure, owe subsidies. That is what debt service ratio means when you translate it into real life. 2. The staircase of numbers, 32 to 38 to 50 to 65. Let's put real numbers next to this fraction. Independent Egyptian economists now talk about a clear staircase in external debt service. In one recent year, external debt service payments were about $32 billion. The next step, around $38 billion. For the coming years, some estimates enter the range of $50 billion. And further out, figures of around $65 billion are discussed. So the staircase looks like this: 32, 38, 50, 65, 65. Now, place that next to the country's main external income sources. Remittances, around $36 to $37 billion in one recent period. Tourism, roughly $15 billion in a good year. Suez Canal, aiming for maybe $10 billion when traffic and prices normalize. Goods exports, about $45 billion, but imports around $95 billion, leaving a trade deficit of roughly $50 billion. The pattern is simple. Debt service is climbing towards $50 to $65 billion, while the combined, stable external income still struggles to cover basic needs and imports. This is why analysts keep stressing, when we say the state needs at least $50 billion in the coming year, that is just to avoid default and roll the debt, not to make life easier for ordinary people. 3. How did we get here? The 168 to 162 story. The next question is obvious. How did we reach a point where 8.5 out of every £10 go to creditors? On the external side, one key number appears in many discussions. At the peak, external public debt reached about $168 billion. After asset sales and some repayments, it moved down slightly towards $162 billion. If you go back about a decade, rough estimates put total external debt much lower, with some references to around $45 to $50 billion in earlier years. So in one decade, we're not talking about an extra $5 or $10 billion, we're talking about an additional $100+ billion in external liabilities. Supporters of the current path will say, yes, but we used that money to build things, Roads, bridges, a new capital, huge infrastructure, power plants, new ports, a monorail. Critics respond with a different question. If we borrowed over $100 billion for development, where is the development that actually pays back the debt? This is where a very dry concept becomes crucial, the investment multiplier. 4. The multiplier test. 100 borrowed, 0 returned. In theory, borrowing itself is not evil. Companies borrow to build factories. Households borrow to buy homes. The key is the multiplier. If you borrow $100 billion and the projects you build generate $120 billion in future income, exports and taxes, the debt can be sustainable. If you borrow $100 billion and the projects generate almost nothing measurable, the debt becomes a pure weight. Some Egyptian economists now use language like this. The country created a multiplier of debt, not a multiplier of income. Why? Because when they look at external debt climbing from lower levels to about $168 billion, debt service jumping from 32 to 38 and towards $50+ billion, budget shares where 65% of spending and 85% of revenues go to debt service, and at the same time, external deficits remain above $40 to $50 billion. The trade deficit stays huge. Many households see no improvement in services. They see a pattern where the most reliable output of the last decade of projects is more debt, not more productive capacity. In one talk, an economist put it harshly but precisely. We borrowed tens of billions, but the new income that helps pay those debts is either invisible or far too small compared to the size of the loans. 5. Fiscal space. Living inside £1.5. Let's come back to the budget picture. £8.5 out of 10, debt service. £1.5 out of 10, everything else. This has very direct consequences for daily life. If you work in a public hospital, teach in a public school, rely on subsidized bread, fuel or public transport, you are effectively trying to function in that £1.5 space. Every time there is a discussion about raising electricity prices, increasing fuel prices, adjusting transport fares, or cutting certain subsidies, it is a symptom of the same underlying reality. The debt bill has first claim on the budget. The remaining 15% of revenues are stretched across more than 100 million people and a very large state. That is why many Egyptians feel a sharp disconnect. They hear about $52.6 billion in projected reserves, about growth targets raised from 4.9% to 5.2%, about rising gold valuations. But their personal reality looks like this: a higher electricity bill than last year, more expensive transport, food prices that never really come down, only rise more slowly, and services that still feel underfunded. From their perspective, the real question is, if all this borrowing and all these projects were meant to help us, why does it feel like every new year starts with a new bill? 6. Taxes, credit, and who actually pays. There is another number in these conversations that matters a lot. Egypt's tax to GDP ratio is often quoted around 12%. For a middle-income country, many experts would expect something closer to 20%. At the same time, roughly 70% of domestic bank credit goes to the state or state-linked entities. The private sector gets the smaller share of lending. This leads analysts to two observations. 1. The burden is uneven. Many large players can negotiate, delay, or minimize their tax contribution. Ordinary citizens pay through indirect taxes on consumption, fees and charges, and the invisible tax of inflation. 2. Crowding out. When the state absorbs 70% of bank credit, there is less room for private businesses. Fewer productive projects, fewer new jobs, weaker tax base in the future. In other words, the state borrows heavily, uses a large share of its revenue to serve old debt, leaves limited fiscal space for services, and then leans on a relatively narrow tax base and price increases to fill the gaps. That is how a macro story becomes a kitchen table story. 7. The sacrifice clock. When does it stop? Even official speeches acknowledge one more uncomfortable truth. Leaders speak openly about generations that must carry the burden, about accepting a period of tight conditions now in exchange for a better future later. On paper, that sounds reasonable. History is full of stories where one generation invests so that the next generation lives better. But Egyptian economists are now asking a very specific follow-up question. When does this sacrifice stop, and when do people actually see the benefits? Because so far the timeline looks like this. A decade of rising debt. External obligations climbing towards $50 to $65 billion per year. Budget shares for debt service reaching 65% of spending and 85% of revenues. Asset sales to plug immediate gaps. Repeated rounds of price increases on fuel, electricity, and services. If the pattern continues unchanged, the risk is that temporary sacrifice becomes permanent normal. Sacrifice was supposed to be a bridge, not the final destination. 8. Circular close. Reading the next economic headline. So how should we read the next set of headlines? When you see reserves above $50 billion, gold reserves increased in value by more than 60%, growth forecast upgraded to 5.2%, successful review with international institutions. You can keep 3 silent subtitles in your head. 1. Debt service ratio. Out of every £10 of revenue, how many go straight to creditors? 2. Fiscal space. After debt service, what is actually left for salaries, schools, hospitals, and investment? 3. Cash versus cosmetics. Are reserves rising because real dollars are coming in, or because the gold we already owned is simply priced higher? Because for an ordinary Egyptian family, the decisive question will never be, did the rating agency upgrade the outlook by 0.3 percentage points? It will always be, after all these billions, borrowed, rolled over and revalued, can we actually afford to live a normal life? Or are we still watching 8.5 out of every £10 disappear into a past we never voted for and a future we don't yet feel? That is why Egypt's current situation is such a powerful case study for Aeon Socium. It shows how numbers can say recovery on paper, while the budget quietly whispers something else. Most of this is not about the future. It is about paying for the past.